So our plan for today, this first session, is to really focus in on supplies. I know that there are a ton of supplies out there, and it's hard to know which supplies that are actually helpful, and how to use some of those supplies. And so we're going to spend some really focused time today going through those supplies and talking about ways we can use them. So hopefully you'll be able to kind of pick out what you'd like to use. Throughout this series, I'll be demoing with a variety of supplies. So whichever supply you have, you'll be able to see it in action for sure. So this is the handout that we'll be kind of working along with today, kind of going through. I think it's important to really kind of discuss the different supplies that are out there. I do want to say that whatever supply you have, you can have a successful watercolor. It doesn't have to be the most expensive, the biggest, the brightest, whatever. Whatever supply you have, you can get a great watercolor painting out of. And so if you have your paper printed out, go ahead and pull that out. This will be a good one to kind of write notes on as well as we're going through it, but also just a really good reference page. I'll be kind of going through this gradually today, so we can kind of talk about it as we go. Another page of the handout that was sent is watercolor facts. We're going to be talking about some of these today. So let's start off. Let's talk about our colors, our watercolor supplies. So in the handout, you'll see there are a couple different types of watercolors. There's the pan set of watercolors, and there are watercolor tubes. They're basically two main types of watercolor. If you have been around for a while, like been in the watercolor world for a while, you know there's also something called a liquid watercolor. We're not going to be talking about that. The truth is there are very few times, very few times where I've used liquid watercolor. It's just a concentrated version of watercolor. Like 98% of the time, I'm using pan watercolor or tube watercolor. This is just another supply that's out there that can be fun to work with. But you'll find that for most of the watercolor that you do, it'll be one of these other two, the pan or the tube. Liquid watercolor is nice, but it's kind of harder to think of ways to use it. These are definitely your better bet. So the first one, pan watercolor sets. This is probably what you'll see in most supply stores. So I have a couple versions here. This one is one that you can get like at the dollar store or like Walmart. It's just a simple set. It already has the watercolor in it. This is like on the cheaper version, but the truth is you can still get wonderful watercolors out of just this. So if this simple pan set is one that you have, then this is like this works. I will say I have rarely ever, actually, I don't think I've ever used the white watercolor. I'm not quite sure why they include it. Because when you lighten watercolor, and we'll talk more about this later, but to lighten your watercolor, you add more water. So this is probably, if you do have the white, you will probably never use it. But these other colors are wonderful. You can blend them and mix them to create so many more. So even if you only have a small set like this, you can still get a variety of watercolor, different colors from it, right? This is a really great starter set. Like if you are wanting to just kind of test watercolor out to see if that's something you enjoy, this is a really good one to start with. And like I said, you can get it at the dollar store and it works just as well. Another pan set, this is one that I found on Amazon, and it has quite a variety. You can see I've used it quite a bit. But this is called like a cake watercolor set. It's a little different from the smaller one that I was showing. This smaller one, it has kind of a waxy feel to it. This one feels more like chalk. There's not a big difference to any of the, like either of these. They're both that pan set. They both get like activated in the same way, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But it's just a different version. Neither one is better than the other, right? It's just a different type of watercolor. And I will say for most of the little projects that I do, this is the set that I pull out. Even though it has a variety of color in here, I'll still mix and blend to get other colors from it as well. So These are some examples of pan sets that you can get. And like I said, like any like price range, even that inexpensive price range works well. You don't have to have the super expensive fancy sets. You can, but you don't have to have it. Here are some examples of watercolor tubes. If you've been in like a Hobby Lobby or a Blick, you'll see these tiny little paint tubes here, and these are for watercolor, right? And so there's not anything that's super like special about them, I guess. It's just a tube of that pigment that you can use to put in a watercolor palette, right? But the benefit of doing a watercolor palette like this and adding your own pigment in is that you get to pick the colors that you want, right? And if you're doing a whole lot of watercolor, this is more cost effective, right? Because you'll be able to use this over and over again. So I'll show, this is my example or my watercolor set that I use for my watercolor painting. You can see it's kind of messy. I use it a lot, but it has the different trays that I'll just squeeze a little bit of pigment in. You don't have to squeeze that whole tube in. You squeeze in just a little bit. And then every time I use it, I'll activate it with some water. You can see I don't have a whole lot in there. It's just little bits of that pigment, because the truth is a little bit of this goes a long way. So you don't need a whole lot, and you'll be able to use this over and over again. I will say, you want to make sure that it's still good. I know if you have the watercolor tubes for too long, they'll get really tough and they're not flexible. And you can see with this one, I can squeeze it still. So there's a lot, like it's good pigment. When it's really hard and you can't squeeze it, then it's not any good and you'll have to get rid of it and get a new one in for sure. But like I said, the tubes are really nice. If you're going to be doing a lot of watercolor, this is a better, this is more cost effective. And you get to choose the colors that you want. So you're not just doing what's in the palette. I will say when it comes to watercolor, you will almost always be blending watercolor, and we'll talk about that more next week. But I rarely use the pigment straight from the tray. You can see here I'm doing a lot of green, like blending with the green. I also have like another tray like this that I use to kind of blend my colors together. The great thing about watercolor is that when it dries, that water evaporates. It stays in there. It doesn't fall out. It doesn't like blend or get on anything else because it's dried on there. And so the way to use it again is just activate it with more water. Right? And so even if you are using the tube watercolors or you're using a pan tray, one of the things that you'll find you'll want is a palette to blend colors on. If you're using the pan set, they generally come with like sectioned lid. This one has 3 sections here, and you can use that to blend your colors. Or you can get something like this. This is just a little plastic tray palette that I can use to blend colors in. I do it a lot, so I have a bigger tray that I'm using. But the truth is, you don't have to have one that has different sections. Even using one flat piece, kind of like this, you can still get lots of colors blended and mixed together that way, right? And so there are different types of palettes that you can use for your tube watercolor. You can do like these smaller sets. This is an example of that, where you just add the watercolor to the different holes, and then this is what you use to blend those colors. This is a really great travel set. You can also, you'll find some that are like metal trays like this that have like magnets on the bottom that you can use to put your watercolor in, the tube watercolor in, and then use that lid for blending, mixing colors. Or just like in the handout, you can get a tray that's kind of like this, that has the different sections there for putting in the watercolor, and then different sections here for mixing and blending. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about today also was where to put those colors. So in the handout, one of the things you'll notice, starter color suggestions, that it's good to have, if you're doing the tubes, it's good to have your primary colors, your basic colors, which are going to be a blue, a red, and a yellow. You'll also want to get a green or a brown, green and a brown, and then a gray, right? And those are really great starter colors. I know when you go down like the paint aisle in any kind of supply store, you'll see that there are tons and tons of color. And so a good way to kind of start is to look for those primary colors, that red, yellow, and blue, and then to find a green, a brown, and a gray. If you have that set, you'll be able to blend and mix and create lots of colors with them. So when it comes to like a red, some of my suggestions would be a vermilion, a brilliant red, or a crimson red. I'm not saying you have to get those colors, but these are some really good ones to start with. If you want to pick out a red, one of those reds would be great. For yellow, there are a couple options as well. Yellow ochre is a really great color, medium yellow, and lemon yellow. That gives you a variety of color as well, a bright yellow to a kind of a brownish yellow. I find that I use yellow a lot when I'm doing paintings. It helps me with skin tones, and it also helps me with landscapes. So yellow, having a couple yellows is really good, but just having one good yellow will get you far as well. Blues, a good blue would be an ultramarine, a phthalo blue, or a cerulean blue. Those are some dark blues and some light blues. They're great for mixing and getting a variety of other color. A green, so the couple greens that I would recommend would be like a phthalo green, a sap green, or a viridian. Those are some really basic greens that are kind of like an olive color to a bright green that you'll be able to, again, mix and make a variety of other colors from them. Good browns to have on hand will be that burnt umber, burnt sienna, or the raw umber. Those are a variety of brown shades that really good. I find I use those a lot. And then a gray. I always recommend a Payne's gray. It's a really dark gray. I will share, I almost never use black because black kind of takes over other colors. Even just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of black will take over other colors you're mixing it with. And so that Payne's gray is a way of darkening a color, darkening that tone without taking over that whole color. So that Payne's gray is one I would recommend too. Now there are sets that you can get that include a variety of tubes, watercolor tubes that you can use. And that's a good starter kit. I know we have a couple links from that if you want to kind of see what that looks like as well. But that's kind of a good starting place color-wise. And then when it comes to knowing where to put it on your tray, I know that can feel a little overwhelming as well. The truth is there's no right or wrong way to put pigment on your tray. You can see with mine that I have here, I have them set up with like colors. So all my greens are together, my blues are together, my yellows, oranges, reds, my browns, they're kind of stuck together. And I also have the lighter colors away from the darkest colors. Again, it's not really that you have to do it a certain way, but you want to kind of set them up similar to this. It's a good suggestion because you don't want any accidental mixing. If you have like a red that's close to like my lightest yellow, sometimes you'll get some overlap and you won't get that true color of yellow. Having them separated by light colors is just a really great starting place for adding that pigment to your tray. And as I said, if you're putting it in those slots, you don't want to use that whole tube. Just a little bit will work well. It'll dry out, so if you touch it, you won't get any transfer, and that's good. It's okay if it dries out. Because it's watercolor, you have to use water to activate it. Let's talk about activating those colors. In here, you'll see that I've got a variety of color here. If you have a watercolor pan set and you touch it, you'll see there's no transfer of pigment, right? And it's because watercolor needs water. It needs water to be able to take it from your palette to your paper. And so one way to get that is to spray water on it or to use a dropper or your brush to transfer water to your palette, right? And so there are a couple like spray bottles that I have around that I use for watercolor. One is a larger one that I use for like my big palette. And then sometimes it's nice having that small one. The truth is, it doesn't matter if it's a big spray bottle or a little spray bottle. You just want to be able to spray it onto your palette. You can also use like a dropper to add water to it, or your brush, and just take your brush from your water cup to your palette. The truth is, like, you can add water to your color and immediately start using it. But the reason you want to activate it, let the water sit there for a while before you use it, is so it picks up more of that pigment. You'll find you're getting a brighter color, a bolder color. When you activate it, spray that water on there and leave it for a moment before using it. Like I said, you don't have to do that way, but that is one way to kind of get the brighter, bolder colors from your kit. So that's a reason to have that spray bottle. And like I said, you can be a spray bottle or a dropper or even just your paintbrush, bringing that water over. But it's good to activate that pigment and let it sit, whether you're doing pan or tube. You want to let it sit for a moment before using it, just so the pigment really starts to kind of mix with that water and picks up a lot of that color. And that's kind of a quick discussion into the different types of pigments: pan, tubes, and palettes. Okay? So the next thing I want to just kind of talk about for a second is if you have been in like the watercolor aisle, the paint aisle, or in like a craft section at a Walmart or Target, one of the things that you may notice with the watercolor set is something called a gouache set. Gouache, gouache. Now, it's very similar to watercolor. It has a lot of the same properties, and so you'll see them kind of hanging together in different stores. But there is a big difference. When it comes to watercolor, if you want to lighten the color, you add water. When it comes to gouache, you use white to lighten that color. It's a thicker pigment, right? Watercolor is more transparent. It has a translucent quality, and gouache is more opaque, right? It's like I said, it's that thicker pigment. Gouache doesn't always blend as well with the other colors. It's not that it's bad. It's a good starter set, getting gouache pigment instead of watercolor. But it is a little different in that way. I think the best way to use gouache is when you're doing planes of color and not really doing a lot of blending. You can blend, but it doesn't blend as well as watercolor does. So I just wanted to mention gouache because that's something that you'll find when you're shopping for watercolor too. Also, one of the good things about gouache is that it does dry faster, which is always nice. When you're using watercolor, it's a very slow process. You're literally waiting for the water to dry, so it takes a little while. With gouache, it does dry faster, which can be really nice. Let's talk about brushes. I know that brushes can feel very, very, very overwhelming. If you have ever been in an art supply store, that brush aisle has a ton of brushes, and it's hard to know which brushes to use, which brushes work best. And so I want to talk about, in the handout, I have several brushes listed here. Know, first off, that you don't have to use all these brushes. These are some different types of brushes. We're going to talk about the reason for using these different shapes, but you'll find as you're doing watercolor, the more you do it, you'll find that you lean towards certain brushes more than others. And I will say, out of all these here, there are about 3 that I use. I don't use the others at all. But I have a friend who uses like the filbert brush we'll talk about in a second. I don't use that one at all, but I have a friend who swears by it and uses that one all the time. So it really comes down to like preference. So we're going to go over these brushes. So these are some of the main watercolor brushes to use. Watercolor brushes are a little different from other brushes that you would use for oil or acrylic or other paint mediums, in that with watercolor you want a fine brush. So you want fine bristles. You can see this one a little easier, my bigger brush a little easier, but it's like These are like nylon. You can also get things like animal hair brushes that work well too. I have found that a lot of times I just want to like feel it and make sure it's kind of a softer brush. That's a good rule of thumb when it comes to watercolor. I found is you just want to make sure those bristles are nice and soft. And so sometimes you get some really good synthetic bristles that work just as well. Again, you want something that has kind of that soft feel to it. And so my watercolor brushes I don't use for acrylic or oil. And it's because my brushes for acrylic and oil paint, they go through, they're a little rougher on them, I guess. That pigment is a little harsher on the brushes, so you need something a little stronger. Like I said, for watercolor, you want something that is kind of uh, gentle, I guess, more gentle and more like finer. Right. So let's kind of walk through some of our brushes here. I want to start off with the angled brush, that first brush. So angled brushes are very similar to a flat brush, and I'm going to pull out a couple examples here to see. So you can see my angled brush. I don't know what's easier. There we go. You can see the angled brush is very similar to the flat brush. You get this nice straight edge on there. This one is just angled a little bit. The angled brush is helpful for getting into tight spaces. So if you are painting something that has like a corner that you want to kind of get that detail into, it's helpful having that angle brush because it comes to that point, a more angled point. So it's easier getting in that corner space. I will say I rarely use an angle brush, but I know some people like the way that feels, right? So they use that angle brush. That flat brush is also, it's just really great for filling in spaces of color. So you can do different sizes of brushes with that angle or with the flat. I will say when it comes to filling in spaces, I generally use a larger brush, right? To cover, like fill in those spaces. Those smaller flat brushes I don't use as often. But again, it really depends on like what you enjoy. It's good to kind of try out the different brushes and know what the best ways to use them. And like I said earlier, I have maybe 3 brushes that I use over and over again. So you'll naturally lean towards certain brushes for sure. But you can see I have a couple different widths. And I will say most of the time, if I'm using a flat brush, it's going to be one of these two. And it's because I am filling in large spaces. And so these wider brushes, I have a better chance of filling in those spaces, right? And doing washes of color. So that's a flat brush and the angled brush. The brushes I use the most and the brushes that are the most versatile are going to be the round brushes. They can create thin and thick lines. And so you can see I have a variety of sizes here. The round brushes kind of come to a point at the top. You can do really thin lines, you can do thicker lines, or you can do varied lines. It's good to have, like if you are using round brushes and you find that this is one that you enjoy, right? Then you can get a variety of sizes. I will say the benefit of the round brush is that it does come to a point, and so you can get a really fine line even with a bigger brush, right? So having those round brushes, like I said, they're the most versatile. You can do a lot of painting with them. I use the round brushes a lot when I'm doing like leaves and flower petals and things like that, because you can get those finer lines and you can cover in those bigger spaces. So a round brush, if you are just starting with watercolor and you want to kind of test it to see if this is something you want to keep diving into, then it's good to start with a round brush. That's typically what you get in these kits are the round brushes. So they can like, because it's the most versatile, right? And so that round brush is a really good one to start with. The next set of brushes I want to talk about are the detail brushes. So the detail brushes are the ones that have the really fine points. You can see I use this one a lot. It's a pretty worn brush, but they are round brushes that are really tiny bristles, right? And this is so you can do fine lines and details. This is where you can do fine, like a lot of line work and add highlights to things. So these are pretty handy to have. Like I said, this is one that I use all the time to get my detail in, but they're really tiny, fine points. Then the mop brush. So this one is pretty handy to have. I don't use it often. I use it probably at the very beginning and then that's it. But you can use other brushes as well. The mop brush is really great for doing big washes and large brush strokes. I will use it a lot of times when I'm doing a sky. I'll use that because it covers a lot of space. But this is one I also use to start a watercolor. One thing that we'll talk about in a moment is that there's a process called wet on wet watercolor painting. And it's where you start with wet paper and a wet brush. And so this mop brush is a really great way to wet the paper first because it covers a lot of space really quickly. So there's a benefit to having the mop brush, but it's not necessary. You can use a regular round brush or a flat brush to cover that surface as well. If you find that you are doing a lot of watercolor, then it may be worth it to get a mop brush. Like I said, I do use mine typically in the beginning and then I won't use it again for the rest of painting, but it is really helpful covering that surface. And then the last brush I want to talk about is the filbert brush. Now this brush has kind of an oval surface. This is the only filbert brush that I own. And it's because I don't use this one generally. But as I shared earlier, I have a friend who like typically only uses the filbert brush. But it's kind of a flat brush. You can see it's kind of flat. But instead of having that flat top, it's rounded a little bit. This one is really great for creating like organic shapes, like leaves. It's really good for doing leaves as well. But you know, as I shared earlier, I like using the round brush to create leaves. So you'll find as you're trying out different supplies, you will find that there are some brushes that you like using more than others. And you may find, like me, that a filbert brush isn't one you want to use often. Like I said, I rarely use this one, but it is good to know that typically it's used for organic shapes for filling in color. You can use other brushes, like these brushes can overlap in their uses, but that's what they're typically designed for, those different things. To store your brushes, the truth is you want to protect your bristles because they are delicate, right? You want to protect them. And so you want to store them either flat or upright because you don't want anything pressing against your bristles, right? And so once you clean your brushes, you can usually what I'll do is I'll take like my brush here, clean it in the water, and then just kind of brush it off with a paper towel or a rag, and then slide it into my pocket to store it. Right? You don't ever want to leave your brushes in the water cup, sitting in the water cup, bristles down, because that will, like that'll bend those bristles. And so we want to protect our bristles. So storing them upright like this, where the bristles are up, or storing them flat is going to be the best way to store them. Watercolor pencils. So when it comes to creating a watercolor, I find, especially if you're doing like a landscape or a portrait or anything like representational, it's helpful to have watercolor pencils. It's not necessary, but watercolor pencils, the benefit of using a watercolor pencil is to do just a little basic sketch, is that watercolor pencils are water soluble, so you don't have to erase it before you add the pigment. Those watercolor pencils will kind of blend into that water and you can use them just straight, which is really nice. And you can get pretty inexpensive ones. I found a set at Five Below that was like $3, I think, and it was a ton of watercolor pencils. You can use like a regular number 2 pencil. You'll just want to kind of erase it before you add the watercolor. It is important to kind of draw a layout just so you can kind of see where everything's going to be. And again, we'll talk more about that as we go through this series. But it's nice to have those watercolor pencils or just a regular pencil. Speaking of water, it's always good to have 2 water cups. I know that feels excessive, but the truth is watercolor pigment needs water. And so having those 2 cups of water is beneficial because one, you can use to clean your brush. The other you use to add water to your pigment. So you're not always adding that dirty like brush water to your pigment. You're having more true colors. So it's always good. And like I usually use something that doesn't look like a cup that I drink out of because I can't tell you how many times I have accidentally or almost taken a sip of paint water. So it's good to have something that looks like a pickle jar or something that like doesn't look like a drinking cup. But you don't have to have a lot of water, but it is a good idea to have 2 separate water cups. So when it comes to paper, watercolor paper, copy paper, drawing paper, the biggest thing to pay attention to is going to be the pounds, right? Most palettes that you find, paper that you find will say watercolor, sketch, drawing, pastel, like it'll tell you what kind of paper it is for. But every type of paper will have pound. Copy paper that you use for your printer will generally be around 68 pounds. If you're doing watercolor paper, you want a higher poundage. So the number you want to look for is like 130, 140. And what that is just a thicker paper, right? When we're doing watercolor, we're adding a lot of water, and so we want paper that holds up to that. So watercolor paper is perfect. You can get watercolor paper to paint with at the dollar store. You can get it at Walmart or Target, and you can also get it at other craft stores too. I will say for most of the watercolor that I do, I buy my paper from like Walmart or Amazon. There are a couple really great brands. Canson is a wonderful brand for watercolor. And so that would be like a good brand, paper brand to get. But this is one I use often. It's Jen Crafts, and it's just an inexpensive one I get from Amazon. Again, the most important part is you want to look for that pound number, because the higher the pound number, the better for watercolor it's going to be. You can get mixed media paper that's anywhere from like 98 pounds to 140 pounds, and mixed media paper will work well. Again, like when you're using watercolor, you want thicker paper that'll hold up to the water and that won't wrinkle. And so that higher pound number is the best one to do. I will say for the paper that I'm going to be using is basically normal paper size. It's 8.5 by 11. Most watercolor paper is either like paper pulp, like bark, wood, or cotton rag. The better quality paper is going to be that cotton rag paper. But that's not as important as like when it comes to hot press or cold press, it talks about how that paper is made. Cold press is generally going to be a rougher surface. Hot press, because it's made with steam, is going to be a smoother surface. One is not better than the other, and that really comes down to preference. I like the rougher paper because I like the texture that it gives. That cold press paper is one you'll find in most places. It's easier to get your hands on. Hot press is generally what you'll find like if you go into an art supply store and you get the fancy paper, is hot press, heat press. Like I said, it's not really that it's better than the other. It's if you want that smoother surface or that rougher surface. I tend to say with the cold press, that rougher surface, like I said, because I like that texture. And that's probably what you'll find in most places is that cold press. And so you see here, I have a little drawing board. I think it's helpful to tape down our paper for a couple reasons. One, it holds the paper still, so there's no accidental twisting or moving while you're painting, and that's huge. The second reason is kind of an aesthetic reason. When we tape it down, we get this nice clean edge, right? And so when you're done painting, you can pull that tape off and you have this nice clean edge, this nice frame outlining your paper. And so like those are two of the main reasons we kind of tape down. We like to tape down our paper. Know that you don't have to, but it is a good route. So I have my board here, and I'm going to show just how to kind of tape down, or one of the ways I tape down paper. So I have my paper that I pulled out. I have my drawing board. You can use like a regular board. I've used a like plastic tub lid before, a flat surface. So I'm going to be using painter's tape to tape it down. I do want to mention that if you don't have painter's tape, masking tape works well. Painter's tape is a little more gentle with paper because you can peel it up and it doesn't tear up the paper. Masking tape, there's a chance it might do that. And so if I'm using masking tape, if you're using masking tape, one of the tricks that I've done before is to pull off my tape and stick it to my clothing before I stick it to my paper. And it makes it a little nicer to our paper when we pull it up. Washi tape is great too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tape down 3 of my 4 sides. And you can see I've just got a little overhang here, taping down the edges. Now, the reason I tape down 3 of my 4 sides to start is because I want this nice frame. Instead of doing my tape on the edge of the 4th side, what I'll generally do is move it in just a little bit. And I make this part my color swatch part. So as I'm blending and mixing colors, I can test it right there on the paper. It's the exact same paper, and so it's like always attached. When I peel the tape off, I'll usually cut that part off before I frame it or give it away or sell it or whatever. But this is what I found has been a really helpful trick for me when it comes to making color swatches of a painting that I'm working on. So that's helpful. You can also use a sponge. I like using sponges when I'm doing like trees, bushes, doing kind of naturey things. I also have my paper towel, my disposable or reusable paper towel. This is great to help kind of clean your brush in between mixing colors. It also helps me see if my brush is clean, like pigment is off of it before I get started. What I would like to suggest is bringing in, if you have watercolor paper handy, and like I said, you can get an expensive one. For the purpose of this series, the inexpensive stuff works just as well. So get the watercolor paper that you can work with and whatever pigment you're using. If you have a pan set or tubes, either one is going to be good. And honestly, if you just have that round brush, you'll be able to do a lot of painting. I do want to say thank you everyone for being a part of today. Thank you so much. And if any questions come up, always feel free to jump in and ask or email us at our contact at Mather email or on our Facebook page. We're happy to answer as many questions as we can.